So note that tolerance, as I'm using it, is a relative term. What matters is not whether a particular society is tolerant according to some sort of idealistic, universal, absolute standard, but rather only whether it's more tolerant than its rivals. So this is like the old joke that I'm sure you've heard your parents tell about the two friends who go on a hiking trip and discover that they're being chased by a bear. And the first runner sits down and starts putting on his running shoes. And then his friend says, "Are you crazy? Why are you putting on your running shoes? You'll never outrun that bear." To which the first hiker replies, "I don't need to outrun the bear. I only need to outrun you." Similarly, in the late 19th century, there was plenty of anti-Semitism in the United States. But for the Jews who were fleeing pogroms in Europe, America was a relative haven and land of opportunity. That's what I mean by relative tolerance. One more preliminary clarification to avoid any misunderstanding. And I always get this one. My thesis is not that more tolerance always leads to more prosperity. I would love it if that were true, but sadly, plenty of brutally intolerant societies have become rich and powerful. Nazi Germany is just a case in point, but one of many. So rather, my thesis is really much more narrow. It's simply that tolerance is necessary for world dominance. That is, if you want to be a hyperpower. Now, whether it's a good thing to be a hyperpower or whether it's good for the world to have a hyperpower are totally different questions, which we can return to later or during Q&A. So let me now turn to some concrete examples, beginning with the hyperpowers of antiquity. Basically, in ancient times, tolerance was the only way to build the largest, most powerful military. So if you limit your army to, say, only pure-blooded Spartans, well, your army's only going to be so big. It's going to be inherently limited in size because how many pure-blooded Spartans are there? By contrast, if you open up your military to warriors of any race or background, you can amass a really huge army. The world is your limit. And this is exactly what the Achaemenid Persians did. Founded in 550 BC by Cyrus the Great, Achaemenid Persian was history's first hyperpower. In terms of size, it dwarfed and in fact conquered and annexed the great kingdoms of Assyria, Babylonia, Mesopotamia, and Egypt, as well as the Greek city-states. At its peak, the empire ruled 40 million people, nearly 1/3 of the world's total population. How could a relatively tiny number of Persians conquer and govern so vast a territory and population? Through tolerance, this kind of strategic tolerance. In contrast to rival kings who typically tried to show their power by forcing their own gods on conquered peoples, Cyrus the Great and his successors did just the opposite. He and his successors were famous for their willingness to let conquered peoples worship their own gods, speak their own languages, and follow their own laws and customs. In addition to making conquered peoples more compliant, the most crucial benefit the Achaemenid kings derived through this kind of strategic tolerance was that it allowed them to build the largest war machine ever known to man. The Achaemenid army was a colossal multinational force, drawing its strength from Greek mercenaries, Phoenician sailors, Libyan charioteers, and hundreds of thousands of foot soldiers from Ethiopia, Bactria, Sogdiana, and elsewhere in the empire. But the Achaemenids' legendary tolerance was not followed by one of its later kings, Xerxes, whose brutality and intolerance are usually said to have sparked resistance and rebellion throughout the empire, triggering its decline and eventual disintegration. Now, in fact, always usually blamed that way, it's actually hard to know whether Xerxes' intolerance actually led to the decline or whether his intolerance was really just a response to a decline that had already begun, right? It's very likely that both propositions are true. So I just wanted to point out that my thesis is asymmetrical. I make a very strong claim about how you can rise to be a hyperpower. I say that tolerance is a necessary, obviously not sufficient, but a necessary condition to becoming a global hyperpower. On the decline, I don't make such a strong causation statement. There are lots of different reasons that you can decline. But I only say that repeatedly, declines of these hyperpowers are associated and coincide with intolerance and xenophobia. In any event, after the fall of the Achaemenid Empire around 330 BC, the world did not see another hyperpower for another 400 years, until Rome's High Empire in the 2nd century AD. Now, I'm actually not going to talk about Rome, just because so many other people have, and I'm guessing you've had lectures on this already. Instead, I just want to make 2 points about Rome. First, Rome far exceeded Achaemenid Persia in its tolerance. Like the Persians, Rome built its massive world-class military by incorporating warriors from every nation. But Rome went much, much further. Whereas all the Achaemenid kings and virtually all of its governors were all Persian, there was no ethnic ceiling in Rome. The Romans permitted educated men of any race or nationality to rise to the very highest positions of authority, including even the position of emperor itself. So the Emperor Septimius Severus, for example, was a North African married to a Syrian. Second point I want to make about Rome. Again, unlike the Persians, Rome combined its tolerance with an uncanny ability to Romanize. That is, to make conquered foreign peoples feel Roman, and to sort of think of themselves as Roman, and identify proudly with the Roman Empire. Later, I'll talk a little bit about how Rome did this, with, I think, some really sobering implications for the United States. Rome lasted longer than any other hyperpower in history, but of course, it too eventually fell. Among the many much disputed causes of Rome's fall, one of the most important was Rome's sharp turn to intolerance, both religious and ethnic. In 312 AD, the Emperor Constantine converted to Christianity, and the Roman Empire, so long famed for its religious openness, embarked on an intensifying wave of persecutions. As Montesquieu later wrote, unlike the ancient Romans who fortified their empire by tolerating every cult, their successors reduced the empire to nothing by cutting out, one after another, all the sects incompatible with the dominant one. At the same time, Rome's ethnic tolerance was pushed beyond its breaking point by the influx of large populations of Germanic barbarians from the north who were viewed as unassimilable. The Romans were frightened and disgusted by these Vandals, Goths, Visigoths, and other Germans. They were repelled by their smell and their huge beastly limbs, and by the rancid butter they smeared in their yellow hair. For the first time, Rome adopted apartheid policies, barring intermarriage and segregating the Germans, who were subjected to growing hostility, violence, and even massacres. The Germans reacted with a vengeance. In the 5th century, Germanic tribes sacked Rome, overran Gaul, took Carthage in North Africa, and sacked Rome again. By 476, the Western Roman Empire was no more. Now, in my book, I discuss 2 other pre-modern hyperpowers. First, Tang Dynasty China, and also the Great Mongol Empire. And for lack of time, let me just talk very briefly about the latter case, the Mongols, which I don't know if I got assigned, but it's my own favorite case. I think it's absolutely fascinating. So the Mongols were nomads. Even their leaders or khans were illiterate. They had no science, no engineering, no written language of their own. The Mongols had no architecture. They lived in yurts or tents made from the felt of yaks. They did not even have the technology to bake bread. And yet, the Mongols came to rule over an empire far larger than the Romans ever conquered, half the known world, including the most magnificent cities of the time: Baghdad, Bukhara, Kiev, Moscow, Damascus, and Samarkand. How did the Mongols do this? Again, through tolerance.